and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, President Putin ramps up nuclear threats once again, this after President Biden greenlights Ukraine's use of long-range US missiles in Russia. After a boost of support from the US, President Zelenskyy addresses a special session of the EU Parliament on this, the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump, the migrant crisis at the US-Mexico border can now be considered as a national emergency, one which he says will require military intervention. And close to 100 aid trucks have been looted in Gaza, meaning further food insecurity for the people of the Palestinian enclave. Welcome to the program. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, does not seem to be letting President Biden's approval of Ukraine's use of US long-range missiles go unanswered. In response, he has approved changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine, now stating that an attack from a non-nuclear state, if backed by a nuclear power, will be treated as a joint assault on Russia. Well, the updated doctrine, proposed last September, was ratified today on what was the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine. Well, Washington has been accused by Russia of escalating the war in Ukraine, or as the Kremlin puts it, adding fuel to the fire. Well, all this comes after President Biden authorized Ukraine to use US-made missiles, allowing it to strike deep into Russian territory for the first time. Well, let's get some more analysis, and we can speak now to Philip Breedlove, who is a retired four-star general who served as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again, General Breedlove. Great to have you with us. I'd like to put to you this new development that we're following here at Al Arabiya. Russia says that Ukraine has fired these US-supplied long-range missiles into Russian territory. And this, of course, just the day after President Zelenskyy was given permission by the Biden administration to do so. What are your thoughts at this stage?
Well, I am thankful that our government has changed its policy. This is a change we should have made years ago. Russia has been firing into Ukraine from the Belarus airspace, Russian airspace, Black Sea airspace. They have been using missiles from at least two other countries and missile parts from China to develop their own missiles to fire into Ukraine. And so we in the West have, in that same time, forbidden Ukraine from using any of our equipment to return fire. It was an absurd policy when it was first made, and hopefully now we are past that point.
I mean, if this is confirmed, do you find it surprising that the Ukrainians were so quick to use this new weaponry?
No, I mean, there have been targets that were appropriate for this kind of missile for months and years. This is a capability that we should have given Ukraine a long time ago. And so they've had a developed target list, and it does not surprise me that they would fire quickly. Remember that in the last 3 or 4 days, Ukraine has come under intense attack by Russia. Russia has increased its ferocity in this attack. Some say it's sort of an answer to Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump told them not to accelerate the war, and Mr. Putin has chosen to accelerate the war since he's been told not to. And so as Russia does accelerate this war, just the other night they fired over 210 long-range weapons into Ukraine. Since they have stepped it up, then Mr. Zelenskyy has replied.
Okay, so of course Ukraine has now confirmed that it's used these attack me's, and we've heard Russia reacting to this, saying this signals a new phase of, quote, Western war. I'm just wondering what you see as being possible next steps by Russia.
Well, Russia is throwing everything they have at Ukraine right now. I'm not sure that there is more left for them to accelerate with. Of course, the Western world is fearful they might use a nuclear weapon. This is what Mr. Putin wants the West to believe. His army has failed him in many ways. His air force has failed him in many ways. His Black Sea fleet has been defeated in the northern Black Sea. What works extremely well for Mr. Putin is his war of intimidation. He continues to threaten the West on almost a daily basis about things that the West told him they were fearful of, nuclear exchange and or a widening of the war. And these are the things that Mr. Putin talks about all the time. What has he done in the last 2 days? He says he signed a new document which changes their nuclear doctrine. This is the way Mr. Putin replies to challenges from the West. He steps up his rhetoric, he steps up his intimidation, and he expects the West to back down.
You don't sound very concerned. I mean, the European top diplomat, Josep Borrell, has said that Russia is irresponsible for using this kind of rhetoric. But how can we be so sure it's just that? It's only rhetoric. How can we be sure that Russia...
I don't think I've said this morning that it's just rhetoric. I just said this is what he uses. We have to be academically honest that he might use some of these weapons. I mean, in our past, we faced similar, if not worse, crises in America, and our President Kennedy stood up to it, and he solved the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in the intermediate nuclear range missile crisis, Mr. Reagan stood up to it, and he solved that crisis. And so we now are in a similar situation to those two. And academically, they both faced real reactions by Russia. And we do face real reactions by Russia. But what we do know for sure is that every time Mr. Putin threatens us, we back up, then we know exactly what the results are. We will be backing up. At some point, the West has to take a look at this threat and take a different action, I think. Just one more point. In 2008, the reply of the West to the invasion and occupation of Georgia was inadequate. We gave great gift to Russia in that they kept 20% of Georgia. We rewarded bad behavior. Then in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. The West's reply was once again inadequate to task. And we rewarded Russian behavior by allowing them to keep portions of Ukraine. And now in 2024, we are faced with a similar situation. Will we once again reward bad behavior, or will we make a change in Western policy?
Well, that remains to be seen, doesn't it, with the new administration coming to power in 2 months from now in D.C. I mean, what do you see the Trump administration bringing to the table with regards to relations with Moscow and with regards specifically to this conflict with Ukraine?
Well, I think that we clearly will have some, as the naval officers say, a sea change in the way this is approached. Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump, former President Trump, has said that he wants to end this war quickly, and I believe it. I think he wants to find an end to this war quickly. I think that at this point, as you've seen many pundits writing, Mr. Putin sees that and sees that he thinks he has the upper hand because he believes Mr. Trump needs a quick end. And so this is going to end up in an interesting negotiation. Mr. Trump has already told Mr. Putin not to accelerate this war. Mr. Putin has chosen to accelerate the war in answer to Mr. Trump's demands. And so I think the conversation has already started.
I just want to pick up on something you were saying a moment ago, recalling the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Of course, that's the closest, isn't it, that the world has come that we know of to proper, full-blown international nuclear warfare. Do you think this is the next most dangerous point that we've come to in history, to full-blown nuclear war?
I'm not sure I would categorize it as that. Again, we had the intermediate range nuclear missile crisis of the Cold War that President Reagan handled. I think that what I would say is that if the West always backs up, we will get closer and closer to nuclear war. A famous Russian thinker once tells a story of, as you approach your enemy, fix your bayonet and press your bayonet into the enemy's belly. And if it is soft, push further and harder. If the belly is hard, step back and reconsider your options. And so right now in 08, in 14, our belly was soft and Mr. Putin is pushing further and harder. We have a choice to make in 2024.
Today is, of course, the 1,000th day of this war in Ukraine. Winter is approaching, and I expect you, like lots of military experts, have been following the conflict very closely these last 3 years. What typically happens at this time of year, or perhaps what typically doesn't happen at this time of year? Perhaps I should rephrase the question, because isn't it a time when people's positions get sort of entrenched, the ground turns extremely hard? Can we expect much to happen on the ground in the next couple of months?
Well, I'm not being rude, but let me correct you. This war is 10 years old. It started in the early winter of 2014 when I was the commander of NATO. And it has been going for 10 years. It's been hot for the first couple of years. Then it went warm as the line in the Donbass settled for some number of years. And now we're almost 1,000 days into the latest part of this 10-year long war. So to the second part of your question, repeat it, please.
I was just wondering what typically happens at this time of year, given that the ground is so hard.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So lots of things happen due to the weather. We go through a really muddy period where the ground is untrafficable for large armored formations. Then we get to a frozen hard period where armored vehicles can once again move, but it's really hard to move an army around when it's so cold. And so then in the spring, we'll go back through another intensely muddy period where there's no trafficability for for heavy weapons for a while. So the tactics of the battlefield seem to settle down. And what happens typically for Russia is they intensify their attack against the Ukrainian people. As you watch how Russia has bombed Ukraine over the last 10 years, and certainly over the last 1,000 days, Russia's attack is almost uniquely towards the Russian or to the Ukrainian people, to Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, all the things that get Ukraine through a cold winter. This is what Russia is attacking. They've proved rather unable to put an intense attack against the Ukrainian forces, so they focus on the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian civil infrastructure.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us once again. General Philip Breedlove, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's get some more analysis now. We can speak to the former spokesperson for the Russian President Vladimir Putin, Sergey Markov, who joins us now from Moscow. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Markov. Washington, of course, gave Ukraine the green light to use those long-range army tactical missile systems weapons, also known as ATACMS, against targets in Russia. And we understand they have now been used in Bryansk. I'm just wondering what more you can tell us about this situation.
I think you explained situation by wrong way. You just repeated those propagandistic lie which expressed by Washington. Situation absolutely another. And Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, stresses very clearly. The point is that it's not allowing for Washington to Ukrainian army to use these rocket missiles. But it's direct using of such rocket missiles against Russia by American army, because Ukrainian army not able to use ATACMS, these ballistic missiles on the long distance to Russia, because Ukrainian army has no technical opportunity such as satellite intelligence group, which needed for using such missiles. Another kind of missiles is Storm Shadow and Scalp, French Scalp and British Storm Shadow. This is cruise missiles. They also cannot be used by Ukrainian army without America, because it's need, first of all, same satellite group, but also it's needed a very good digital map of Russian territory for such cruise missile. It's even Great Britain and France has not such kind of map, but only Russia and United States. So if these missiles will be used against Russia, it means that American army directly took to the war against Russia. It's not Ukrainian. It's American strike against Russian cities and in other places. It's the point. It's this rocket missile didn't change situation dramatically on the front line, because these missiles have been used already against Crimea, against Donbass, and another new territory of Russia, internationally not recognized.
So if they have been used, Mr. Markov, if they have been used, how's Russia going to respond? How's Russia going to respond if they have been used?
Nobody knows.
Well, Russia must know.
Decide. Russia will wait some moment. Probably Russia will give a strong military response. It means Russia now has the right to attack all American military goals. American military base in Poland, in Germany, in Romania, and another European countries. Also, Russia can attack the American satellites group, which used for such kind of attack, American aviation, military aviation, and so on. Okay. And its military response. Probably first Russia will try to give some political response, taking account that this is crime of Joe Biden group. Joe Biden is some kind of regarded in Moscow as a maniac who personally hate Vladimir Putin, because in 2011, Biden strongly recommended Putin not to go to the next presidential term, and Vladimir Putin strongly said no to him.
Let me put this question to you. Let me put this question to you, Mr. Markov. Is the West now in direct conflict with Russia?
Can you repeat? Sorry.
Is the West now in direct conflict with Russia?
Not yet, because we didn't see this big strike yet. There are some rumors that probably in Bryansk region had been used or not used. Now we see indirect through media information about that Biden made the decision to come to the direct war against Russia. But we didn't see the real fact about it. When Vladimir Putin sees the real fact, he will react. Frankly speaking, if it will be not strike against Washington and London, it's first of all because goodwill of Vladimir Putin.
Just want to pick up on something you said to the British media. You said that people in the UK could be spending Christmas in bomb shelters. Could you just clarify for us what you meant by that?
Yeah. It's very easily. Of course, Vladimir Putin don't want to give a strong military response and to come to the big global war. Of course, Vladimir Putin don't want to have nuclear war. But you understand, if United States and Great Britain started direct attacking of their militaries against Russia, Russia has to respond. And if it will be exchange of rocket missiles, first of all, non-nuclear, but then it could be moved, because it's nuclear powers, it could be moved to the nuclear, using of nuclear weaponry, and possibly already this year, big nuclear catastrophe could happen. And already mentioned that probably it will happen before Christmas holidays. And probably instead of saying Merry Christmas to all families, British and American people, and we will have to sit down in the holes in the S, trying to hide away from the radioactive clouds.
Okay, well, that's something to think about. And of course, Mr. Putin has lowered the threshold for a nuclear strike. And this is my last question to you. I mean, just listening to what you were saying and listening to the rhetoric from Moscow the last 24 hours, there are people in the West who say every time the West steps up its support for Ukraine, Russia threatens nuclear war. And of course, we're 1,000 days into this conflict. So far, that hasn't happened. So what is your message to people who say that Russia is simply bluffing?
Russia don't want to use nuclear weaponry, but Russia wants to stress that if three nuclear powers like United States, Great Britain, and France come to the war against another nuclear power, Russia, this nuclear war could happen even by some natural development of the events. Look how World War I started. Nobody wanted such a big catastrophe as appeared to be this great war as 111. But it happened because events move politicians. Events command politicians, but not politicians command events. It's a situation with Russia afraid very much. And Russia, and I am ask you, British people, don't attack Russia. Don't send your rocket missiles to Russian cities. As a way, you will have the response of Russian rocket missiles to your cities. Take this in your mind.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Sergey Markov, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, as the US gives Ukraine the green light to use American-supplied long-range missiles in Russia, the world now looks to the United Kingdom to see if they're going to follow suit. Well, joining us now from London is Sean Bell, a military expert and former RAF fighter pilot. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Al Arabiya News. We've received this confirmation now that Ukraine has indeed fired these US-supplied long-range missiles into Russian territory. I'd just like to ask for your thoughts.
Well, it's in a way, it feels as a military guy, a story about nothing. Part of the reason for that is that, Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine has been seeking help from the West. The West has been providing weapons. But for some reason, the West decided to, rather than just say, use these weapons in accordance with the law of armed conflict, off you go, it puts some restrictions on them. And of course, that means as soon as those restrictions get lifted, then all of a sudden it gives an opportunity for President Putin to wail again. That Russia has been targeting Ukraine across the whole country, energy infrastructure, headquarters, ammunition dumps, railway yards, airfields. It does seem a bit bizarre that Ukraine is not allowed to do exactly the same thing to Russia. And the fact that Russia will wail about it, it's been wailing every step of the way when the West has been involved. I don't think we're seeing anything particularly new yet. I think what's also interesting is whether or not the UK will follow suit, and the French with the Scalp and obviously the Storm Shadow missile. But to be brutally honest, these weapons, although it's symbolic, there aren't many of these attackers around. They're very expensive. Storm Shadow is limited supply. Actually, this won't be a turning point of the war. Even President Zelenskyy admitted that. But it has created a bit of a furore in the media and, of course, for President Putin.
Okay, of course, Ukraine hasn't wasted any time using these new weapons. I mean, so what you're basically saying is that ATACMS and that category of weapon is not likely to be a game changer, and there's nothing particularly significant about them as weapons. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is ATACMS is a very spectacular weapon. I mean, it's supersonic, it goes ballistic, it goes 200 miles, it's precision strike. it's very, very effective. The downside is that they're over $1 million a shot. The warhead is only £500, so it can't do a significant amount of damage. And because they are so expensive, there's very limited supplies of them. It's not as if Ukraine is going to have vast quantities of these to be able to throw around at targets in Ukraine. The other challenge, of course, is that unlike conventional sort of anti-tank weapons, bullets and stuff like that, you can give them to the soldiers on the ground, they just fire them. When you're firing a target 200 miles away, you don't know where the target is. You need a whole load of intelligence, satellite imagery, trying to work out, is it worth firing this very expensive round? It's going to take several minutes to get there, all of which is valuable for a certain target set. But actually, it's going to be very limited numbers of these weapons actually available, and they take a lot of complex planning. The one benefit, of course, is that we understand President Putin's already moved most of his fighter jets outside 200 miles radius of Ukraine, therefore keep them out of reach. Why is that value to Ukraine? Well, it means it's a lot more complicated for those air missions to get all the way to Ukraine, do their job and get back again with the limited fuel they have available. So it is having an effect, but it won't be the seismic change that I think some of the media are portraying it.
And of course, we've heard Moscow saying that the threshold for a nuclear strike has now been lowered. I mean, do you think, as many people who've spoken to us on this channel have said, that this is just rhetoric? Or do you think that perhaps this time Mr. Putin might be serious about carrying out a nuclear strike?
Problem is, Tom, I've got grey hair here. I've been around the block a few times. When I joined the military, we're in the Cold War. We were planning, expecting nuclear Armageddon. We were planning one-way sorties. For the last 30 years, that's not been on the table at all, and I think people have got a bit desensitized to it all. And whilst the nuclear weapons are abhorrent, their very existence is abhorrent, but they are with us. But there's mutually assured destruction. If either side was to use them, it wipes them out completely. I have no doubt Putin has no intention whatsoever of using nuclear weapons. That would lead to Armageddon. That's to nobody's benefit. What he is doing very successfully and has done throughout this war is try to scare the West, because the West, we talk about the West as being a unified body of countries. It's only actually as strong as the weakest link, and many people get nervous, understandably so, when we talk about nuclear weapons. And therefore, Putin has found that rhetoric is incredibly effective at stultifying, limiting what the West is prepared to do. I've little doubt that at the moment, if you listen to the words and look at in detail what he said, he's actually not changed anything. We're no closer to nuclear Armageddon, but my goodness, has it rattled cages and caused the world's media to focus? That has having exactly the effect that President Putin was trying to achieve with this rhetoric.
Yeah, but not only him. We've also heard Donald Trump Jr., for example, saying that the outgoing Biden administration is trying to lead the United States into World War III, or words to that effect. And there are also those analysts who are saying we're now entering the most dangerous phase of what's been a 1,000-day conflict, if you count the start of the Russian invasion as being the start of this conflict. Why do you think people are calling it the most dangerous phase? Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think you've got to split out the US politic angle here. We could spend hours talking about that, couldn't we? I don't think that necessarily has got to do with the military effectiveness. That is a bit of the new boy coming in town. The king is dead, long live the king. There's been even talk that Biden's only done this to make life more difficult for Trump. I don't buy that at all. I think there's a very clear reason. Ukraine is embattled at the moment. It might be that as we approach the 20th of January, that actually there might be a window of opportunity for a negotiation. If that negotiation is to bear fruit, Russia will not want to have any Ukraine forces on Russian territory. At the moment in the Kursk region, there are quite a number. Russia is throwing 50,000 troops and a load of North Korean troops and trying to get rid of the Ukrainians out of that area. And that's why I believe Biden has given the green light, not to go and strike targets all over Russia, but to try and help Ukraine maintain their foothold there, because that will give them a stronger negotiating position come the day if there is a negotiation.
And on this 1,000th day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what's your assessment of what the situation is like on the ground as we head into the winter months?
Well, I was there, Tom, only a few weeks ago. I went for a week, and whilst I can't plane to have a dip test of the whole country, and I didn't go anywhere near the front line. I'm way too past my best sell-by date for that. But I sensed a very different mood in the country from many, many months, indeed years of absolute, we're going to beat the Russians, it's just a matter of time. There was this sense of weariness, the sense that the prospect of victory, whatever that meant, but in Ukrainians' eyes of kicking Russia out of every corner of Ukraine, was that prospect fading out of view? And therefore, how would this war end? And I sense there was a much different tone about the conflict. And the danger, of course, is that Ukraine is on the back foot. They are struggling. They've had the best that the West has available to offer. It looks likely under the Trump administration, there might be less available. And therefore, for Ukraine, the prospects are looking quite bleak. And therefore, is it the right time to stop Russia suddenly doing a breakthrough and potentially take a lot more of Ukraine? Or is the chance to actually sit down and try to maybe cede territory? It's a horrible conversation, Tom. I mean, it's no win either way, but the loss of life has been significant. You only have to go to Maidan Square in the middle of the capital, Kyiv, and see the tens of thousands of flags fluttering. It's a poignant reminder of the growing toll of this war. And there might be that actually Ukrainians are starting to look at, is there another way for this war to end that might mean that we see territory, but by contrast, that secures their sovereignty of what remains into the future and secure funding for rebuilding their country?
Yeah, and when we hear President Zelenskyy speaking today on the anniversary of the 1,000 days of warfare in his country, he says that the year 2025 is going to be a decisive one in determining who wins the war. And I'm just wondering why you think he thinks that is the case. I mean, is that, do you think, principally because of politics in the United States?
I think there's a lot of that because, let's face it, although Europe and the US give a roughly equal amount of money, in terms of military equipment, it's the US that by far and away predominates that. And therefore, there's no doubt Zelenskyy will be concerned. I think we've got to be careful about some of the rhetoric. We've both been following this for some time. It was only springtime last year when President Zelenskyy was announcing his spring offensive. He said a few months earlier, give me the weapons and I'll sweep Russia out. Well, last year, we didn't really see much movement in the front line. And this year, it's all been Ukraine on the back foot. Zelensky's prepared a victory plan that hasn't really docked very well at all. And bluntly, the only way that really Ukraine is going to sweep Russia out is if the West was actually to get directly involved, put a no-fly zone in place, potentially put combatants on the ground, and Russia wouldn't have an answer to that. But as we stand at the moment, there's no appetite for Western politicians to get directly involved. And therefore, the prospects for a victory, whatever that means for Ukraine, don't look very likely. But therefore, what does good look like, given where we stand today? I think that's where probably President Zelenskyy start to focus a bit more today.
Indeed, and he also said that he wants Europe in particular to push Russia harder, he said. And I'm just wondering where you think, with this change of administration about to happen in 2 months from now in Washington, whether you can see the EU and the UK perhaps using their influence. And let's not forget, even the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said that support for Ukraine was ironclad only today. Similar language being used by European leaders. Do you think those EU leaders and the UK leadership can somehow pressure or influence the incoming Trump administration and somehow try to get Trump to be more supportive of Ukraine than he suggested that he might be?
I've no doubt they'll try and have an influence. I mean, I think one of the unknowns here is that President Trump, Trump, has been very good at the rhetoric. What actually gets delivered is often another matter. You'll recall when he first came to power, he said, I'm going to build a wall with Mexico. Didn't finish that. I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East. He certainly didn't deliver that. And he said, I'm going to deal with that little man from North Korea. And he didn't do that either. What it did, though, it gave a clear idea of where his intent was. And his intent at the moment is clearly America first. It's clearly that NATO, if it is to exist, everybody needs to pay their way. And that's a wake-up call for Europe. And he's also turned around and said, look, I'm going to be focused on China. You Europeans, you probably need to focus on Russia. Now step up to the plate and start to react. And unfortunately, that is very difficult for some European countries to do because there's a big yawning gap between if America was to reduce its level of support, it's going to be a very difficult gap for the Europeans to fill. So I do think there's some interesting conversations to happen. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. President Trump, from this side of the pond, it looks a bit alarming. But I have to say, on a positive side, I suspect he might be a bit of a breath of fresh air because he's going to be combative. He's going to meet force with force. He's going to intimidate. And that might be just the way to deal with some of these autocrats that are around the world.
OK, well, it's been really great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time. Sean Bell, thank you so much.
Cheers, Tom.
1,000 days and counting since Russia began its long drawn-out military action in Ukraine. But according to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, at least 11,743 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. Nearly 25,000 others have been injured. At least 589 of the victims are thought to have been children. Well, even as the fighting shows no signs of slowing down, the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy vowed that his country will never submit.
While some European leaders think about, some elections or something like this at Ukraine's expense, Putin is focused on winning this war. He will not stop on his own. The more time he has, the worse the conditions become. Every today is the best moment to push Russia harder, and it's clear without certain key factors, Russia will lack real motivation to engage in meaningful negotiations.
Well, President Zelenskyy, speaking to the European Parliament, noted that 2025 will have, quote, decisive moments on who will prevail in this fight.
We need resilience of entire Ukraine at decisive moments which will come next year. We should prevent anyone in the world from doubting the resilience of our country. At this stage of the war, it is being decided who will prevail, whether us over the enemy or the enemy over us Ukrainian and Europeans.
President Zelenskyy speaking there. Well, let's get some more analysis and we can speak to Oleksiy Goncharenko, who is a Ukrainian politician, member of the Ukrainian Parliament, who joins us now from Kyiv. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Some news just coming into us. Washington has, of course, given Ukraine this green light to use long-range army tactical missile systems weapons, which are also known as ATACMS, against military targets in Russia. And according to reports, Ukraine has used them already now in the region of Bryansk in Russia. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, we have these reports that a big depot of Russian artillery shells and missiles was destroyed this night. And this is announced by Russian Ministry of Defense, that it was done with ATACMS, American ATACMS. So if to believe them, and I don't know for what reason they could have to lie in these occasions. They often lie, but this time I don't know for what they can do this. It was done by ATACMS. And that's great. That means that these weapons works in the hands of Ukrainian military.
Russia saying that the use of ATACMS by Ukraine would signal a new phase of Western war. What do you think Russia means by this?
I don't know. It's bluffing once again. Russia said, oh, if something like this would happen, that would mean some Armageddon. And what? Just minutes ago, Lavrov commented it in Lavrov, his Russian foreign minister. He commented it in Rio de Janeiro at G20 meeting. He said, we are very strongly against any possibility of nuclear war. And it was very funny. He said that we are not still finally sure that it was American missiles. So Russian Ministry of Defense said it is American missiles. Russian Foreign Ministry is not sure is it American missiles. So I can tell you there will be no significant reaction or some specific escalation from Russia. Everything they can do against Ukraine, they are already doing. And they don't have capacity to attack any other country because they are not so strong like they try to show. They can't win over Ukraine, which is in several times smaller than Russia in population, in economics. They prepared for this war in years, but they can't win over Ukraine. How they could attack NATO?
You say that the Russians have tried everything already, but they haven't used nuclear weapons ever. And we've been hearing this rhetoric about the Third World War, and it hasn't just been coming from Moscow. It even came from people inside the incoming Trump administration. I mean, aren't you concerned that we could be about to enter an extremely serious phase in this conflict?
As I told you, I think this is a bluffing. And if Russia will go nukes, that will be the end of Russia itself and the end of physical life of people like Putin, Lavrov, and others. So I don't believe they would ever do this. Also, don't forget that Russia is not alone. They're part of this axis of chaos. China, North Korea, Iran, and all these countries, they are also afraid of any nuclear war because that will be the end. So I don't believe in all this bluffing from Russia that they will do something special. We heard it many times. If Crimea would be attacked, if Crimean Bridge would be attacked, if something else would be attacked. Ukraine is not using nukes. Russia can't use nukes either.
You mentioned North Korea. 10,000 North Korean troops reported to have been deployed to the battlefield. I'm just wondering what sort of a difference they're making.
For the moment, I can't say they're making some difference. It definitely shows the global character of the conflict, where North Koreans are in Europe, probably fighting with Europeans. But it's not still clear how Russia is using these troops, how actively they're going to use it, or they want to use it as an auxiliary troops to free Russian units, whether they want to use it on Russian-Ukrainian border, or they want to use them inside Ukrainian territory. We just don't know for the moment. But definitely they are in Russia. That's something we do know. And we know that they're very close to frontline, and there were already occasions when they were involved in the hostilities. That's what we know for the moment, and we are closely following the development of the situation.
Today is, of course, an important milestone in the war. 1,000 days since the Russian invasion began. And today you were on X, also known as Twitter, and you said, quote, Putin wanted to take Ukraine for himself quickly, but we're still resisting. Just tell us, what is the situation on the battlefield? How is Ukraine doing 1,000 days into this war?
Much, much, much better than everybody in the world predicted, including Putin, who was saying that Russia will end with Ukraine in 2-3 days, in 2-3 weeks. As you see, it's already 1,000 days. Ukraine is not finished, even more. Ukraine succeeded to liberate parts of occupied territories. There is no one regional center which was taken by Russia during this invasion. But yes, it's very difficult for us, a lot of victims. Russia occupied part of our territory, additional part, plus to what was occupied in 2014. So altogether, near 20% of Ukrainian territories is occupied, which is very painful for us, but Ukraine is alive. And Ukraine is candidate now to European Union member, and I'm sure we will be. And the Ukrainian army is today, I think, one of the strongest armies in the world. Together with the United States and Russia. I agree, Russian army is also strong because of what their battlefield experience, but Ukrainian army also. So we are clearly not in the catastrophe. We are resilient, and we're not going to lose.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Oleksiy Goncharenko.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the US President-elect Donald Trump has said he is willing to make use of the military to deport migrants in large numbers. While taking to social media, he indicated that he would declare an emergency and use military assets to carry out mass deportations. Well, the issue of immigration has become an increasingly important issue and a leading cause for concern, dissent, and debate within the United States. Let's take a look at some numbers for you. The US is home to 1/5 of the world's international immigrants. About 11 million undocumented immigrants live in the United States, making up 3% of the country's population. Well, as of 2022, unauthorized immigrants made up 23% of US foreign-born population in 2022, higher than when Trump was president back in 2019. Well, the president-elect built his campaign on the foundations of immigration reform, repeatedly promising his supporters to mobilize the National Guard and aid the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, known as ICE, to carry out deportations. Well, for more, we're joined now by Ronald Vitiello, a former ICE director who was also the chief of Border Patrol during the last Trump administration. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. The incoming Trump administration says it's going to declare a national emergency and use the military to carry out these mass deportations. Is this really a national emergency?
Well, we've just gone through a crisis about the last 4 years with unprecedented illegal entries at the southwest border. At the peak, 10,000 people a day were crossing the border illegally. The government itself, the DHS itself, has said that 85% of those people have been released into the country, so they now live amongst us in every city and town in America. We're also faced with a terrible opioid crisis across the country in which hundreds of thousands in the last 2 years of Americans have died or been poisoned by this deadly fentanyl. So it has been an emergency for the last 3+ years. And so a correction needs to occur. I support the president's idea that we need to fix the border, stop the leak and stop the chaos at the immediate border, at the southwest border, but then repair and fix the security situation in the rest of the country. And that will require more than the organic assets that ICE and the DHS have at their disposal now.
So who should be most concerned about this development? Who's at the top of the list for deportation?
Well, the president has been very clear that the criminals and threats to public safety would be at the top of the list for targeted enforcement, immigration enforcement in cities and towns all over the United States. So those with convictions, those who are wanted in other countries, those who have run afoul of the law in the United States, the worst are going to go first.
How many will we be talking in that case?
I've seen open source reporting in the press that there's 8+ million people on what the government calls the non-detained docket. That's 8 million people who are in the country and they have no status and they need to see an immigration judge. Some of them have already been ordered removed. And in that ordered removed category, there are 1.5 million people who have some sort of criminal involvement or a criminal record. They're either wanted somewhere or they've committed crimes that make them ineligible to get relief from an immigration judge in the United States. So at minimum, there's 1.5 million people who are in the country illegally and have also committed crimes in the communities and towns that they live in.
Okay, according to the American Immigration Council, deporting 1 million people would cost more than $960 billion over the period of a decade. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. Is it worth it?
Well, there's been times in the history of the United States. I heard yesterday that when Barack Obama was president, he managed to deport almost 4 million people in his first term. And so, yeah, I mean, it involves logistics, it involves employees, it involves salaries, it involves detention, it involves airplane flights to repatriate people and take them back home. And so, yeah, it's expensive, but it also minimizes the impact all over the country of lowering wages, of our school systems that are overburdened, our cities and towns that don't have enough properties to rent. So there is a net benefit in the security of the United States, first and foremost. And then it helps in some of these other areas as well. And so, yes, it might be expensive, but you are paying for national security along with border security.
Let's talk about this mass deportation program. It's supposed to begin on the first day of the new Trump presidency, but can it really get started on day one? Because, of course, there's due process, isn't there, for each case to be considered really on a case-by-case basis?
Well, all operations of the government require a will from the commander-in-chief to support the front line. Right now, as we speak today, in many of the large cities in the United States, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, enforcement removal officers are out looking for the worst of the worst. They're looking for people who have run afoul of the law in their own community and are also in the country illegally. And so they can take the handcuffs off. They can prioritize those activities while a plan is being written, while a plan is being coordinated, while the logistics are put in place to scale up their work. There's about 150 of those officers in the United States, but there's nearly 20,000 immigration officers in ICE. And so you can reallocate the existing resources in ICE, perhaps get some help from the Department of Defense, and use the state and local cooperation agreements that exist today and enhance and improve those along the way. So starting day one, they can prioritize this activity and add resources as the plans are written and operationalized.
Okay, but I mean, obviously there are going to be legal challenges, and that's going to hold the process up because obviously due process can't be completely disregarded. But then not just legal challenges, there's also going to be logistical challenges. I mean, there's talk of large-scale detention camps being built, tents being built. I mean, all that's going to take a huge amount of time, isn't it?
Well, there will be a time factor into when they can get it to scale. But as it relates to the legal factors, that 1.5 million criminally involved aliens are in the country, and many of them have already been ordered deported by a judge. They are already on the path for removal. They're just not in government custody to go ahead and repatriate them back home. And so the law is very clear. It's against the law to cross the border illegally without being inspected and stay in the United States. It's also against the law to work while you're illegally in the United States or to be hired by an employer. Employers can be fined for similar things. And so the legal footing that the president will stand on for targeted enforcement against the worst of the worst, and then scale up to the 20 plus million people that are in the country illegally. The law is very clear on status there. And there is a due process element. And I would just say in the last 3.5 years, the government has spent billions of dollars in caring for people who are in custody when they rush the border for the last 3.5 years. There are facilities, there are about 8 facilities across the U.S.-Mexico border on the U.S. side that temporarily hold people before they're released in the United States. One of those large facilities in the El Paso area cost $1 billion a year to run. And so we're already spending enormous amounts of money for the flow that is occurring today. If you stop the leak and repurpose those facilities, you could scale this up fairly quickly.
But I mean, talking about cost again, I mean, the costs, really go into the stratosphere at a certain point because we've talked about the cost of deporting 1 million people, and that would be somewhere in the region of 960 billion. Donald Trump says there are between 15 and 20 million people who could be drawn up on a list for deportation. I mean, just doing the maths, I mean, even if it's 10 million, which is what Pew Research says it is, the number of people who could be deported, we're talking about 10 trillion US dollars. I mean, does the United States even have that kind of money? Because last time I checked, it's about 1/3 of national debt.
It's going to be expensive. They're going to require resources. But I will just tell you that when we had the largest surge at the border of its time in 2014, when Barack Obama was the president, again, they were deporting hundreds of thousands of people every single day. When he asked career people like me to fix the problems at the southwest border, we put a number of steps in place to deter people from leaving home and trying to come into the United States because we ended the incentives. If you end the incentive to be in the United States illegally, many people will elect to go home by themselves. You'll remember that when Donald Trump became the president in 2018, there was a mass exodus from the United States into Canada of people who were illegally in the country and were fearful of being deported and removed by the U.S. government, and they fled to Canada. So some people will elect to go home to stay out of immigration detention, to stay out of the logistics chain, the pipeline, to be returned home. And so it's not just government agencies going out and putting hands on every single of the 20 million people that have come into the United States in the last several years. It will also be able to verify departures of people who wish not to stay under the conditions in which they can't find a job, that if they get arrested by local authorities, they're going to be immediately referred to ICE for removal, and then a concentrated effort to find the worst of the worst across the United States.
But we're talking about some people who, for example, like the Dreamers, who came to the United States as children. I'm just wondering whether they'd be concerned by sweeping deportations, and whether the DACA legislation brought in by the Obama administration, that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, whether that would be scrapped. What's your understanding of what would happen to those people?
Well, DACA is not law in the United States. It was a function of the executive branch. The president authorized the Department of Homeland Security to defer deportations for people that fell in that certain category. The Supreme Court has ruled that action to be illegal. Trump tried to end it in his first term. He tried to end the program and enrollments in the program in his first term. It was pushed back by the courts, and the courts didn't weigh that case on the merits. So it's not immigration law. But if we're starting with the worst of the worst and we're prioritizing the existing assets that DHS has now to focus on threats to public safety, it'll be a long time before we get to a place where somebody that's been in the country for over a decade will be on a path for removal.
And just lastly, tell us a bit about how you envisage your role being in the new Trump administration. And by extension of that, do you envisage more sections of border wall being built during Trump 2.0?
Well, I'm not a government employee now, but yes, I think that there are some unfinished portions of the border in which material and contracts were let to build border wall that will be reinstated. We've learned a lot over the last 3.5 years when the U.S. government sued Arizona and Texas for trying to protect their own borders. And so some of the infrastructure and some of the lessons learned in those will be applied to a new regime for infrastructure on the border. So I expect that the men and women of the Border Patrol are going to have the kind of support that they've not had in the last administration, the Biden administration, and will return to someone in the Oval Office that knows what they do and wants to give them the tools that they have to succeed.
Okay, Ron Vitiello, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to Al Arabiya News.
Thank you.
Now, for several months, the humanitarian situation in Gaza has been critical, and now the situation has just got even worse. This after nearly 100 aid trucks were looted, marking one of the worst aid losses during the course of this 13-month-long war. Well, the convoy carrying food from the UN, UNRWA and the World Food Programme was abruptly rerouted by the Israeli authorities at the Kerem Shalom border crossing, and the looting occurred shortly thereafter. Well, the identity of the looters remains unclear. Israel is accusing Hamas, whilst Hamas claims to have killed 20 individuals that they labelled as gang members. Well, for more, we can speak now to UNRWA spokesperson Adnan Abu Hasna, who joins us from Cairo. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Just tell us a little bit more about what happened in Gaza with those looted food aid trucks.
You know, we have, lots of food aid actually waiting at the crossing point of Kerem Shalom. Suddenly, the Israeli authority told, the UN organization that we have, it was a short notice actually, to let, more than 100 trucks of loaded food and flour to leave the area of the crossing point and to use another way, another road as alternative. It's not the usual road. And suddenly, after moving the trucks, towards Khan Yunis and the middle area, as usual, armed gangs, jumped over, the trucks and forced the drivers to stop. And more than 100 trucks had been looted.
Who should carry the responsibility for this? Because, of course, aid trucks are supposed to have security surrounding them. I mean, whose obligation is it to provide secure passage to that convoy?
In the past, the civil police used to protect, the convoys, but they were hit and they were targeted, and many of them were killed. And even, some groups tried, to arrange a kind of protection, but also they were forbidden from doing that, and also they were targeted. We believe it is the responsibility of the occupying power. It is the responsibility of Israel, as it is really occupying Gaza. It is the reality, there. They have to protect the convoys until it reaches, to the needy people. Otherwise, leaving things like that to gangs, armed gangs, many people now, many gangs in Gaza, at that, specifically that area, and east of Rafah and Khan Yunis, they are, all the time looting what we bring in. Now we are talking about, two kinds of, or two elements joined together and, pushing for the starvation of Gaza. The amount of food that entering Gaza is very little. And after that, if we succeed to get that little into Gaza, we are, we are shocked, or we are faced by these gangs that, controlling everything and looting everything. And 90% of the goods that we get into Gaza are being looted right now.
Yeah, I was going to say it was less than that. According to some reports, I read half the aid that enters Gaza is ultimately looted. It sounds like it's much more than that. And I'm just wondering if this is perhaps a sign of just how increasingly desperate the situation is getting in Gaza. If people are resorting to these techniques, how close to being in a state of famine are parts of the territory?
People are very frustrated. They are desperate, and they don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. Actually, so now we are talking the Gaza Strip in the northern part of Gaza Strip. We are talking about some places there is famine there. No one can deny that. Even all the reports that coming out from that, they are talking about people who did not, eat for 2 or 3 days. And actually, there is nothing to eat in Jabalia, Beit Hanun, and Beit Lahia area. And we are, now watching, phenomena like that and signs of hunger in the southern part of Gaza Strip. And we believe if the disorder and the amount of food that, getting into Gaza is so little, if this continue like that, and there is no drastic measures actually to improve the situation, we will be facing 100% famine in the southern part of the Gaza Strip.
I just want to ask you about what Hamas has been saying with regards to the people it says were responsible for the looting of the aid convoy. Hamas saying 20 people were killed, calling these people gang members and warning looters in the future they'll be treated with, quote, an iron fist. Do we know anything about what happened to those people that were killed and who they were?
We don't know. So, people, there are many rumors and many talks about that. People said that they're, living beside the fence. They're from families. They are actually thieves. No one, for us as a UN, we don't know exactly, what's going on. It is the responsibility of Israel and the responsibility of also any kind of administration, in the Gaza Strip. They have to intervene. We have to get rid of all of that. Otherwise, there will be a catastrophe in the Gaza Strip related to famine, related to hunger, diseases, and everything. It's an unbearable situation right now.
And it could get worse, couldn't it? Because UNRWA has been banned from operating in Israel. A 90-day deadline was put in place, and that was some weeks ago. So what sort of contingencies, what can be done to prepare Gaza for the post-UNRWA phase?
No, right now they did not actually implement all the laws or legislation that had been adopted by the Israeli parliament. If they really want to implement it in 90 days, I think that they are cutting off the lifeline of Gaza life. No UN organization can replace UNRWA. They don't have the capacity, the logistic, ability. They don't have staff like us. We have 13,000 staff in the Gaza Strip. We have hundreds of trucks, of cars, of installation. We have the experience. We have the data. We have, everything. Other UN organization, you are talking about organization, very small organization, regarding, related to UNRWA, like UNICEF, WFP, or WHO, talking about tens of people only. working there. So the only, body who can really deliver, in the Gaza Strip is UNRWA. Otherwise, if Israel, they don't want UNRWA, the IDF can do it directly. They can, collect, all the garbage. They can be responsible for the health, for education. If they can deliver, okay, they are welcome, to do that. Otherwise, they have to leave. The only remained body in the Gaza Strip who's doing, like not only a major role, but most of the functions of the other UN organization or NGOs are depending on us to deliver also. So if the IDF can do the job and replace UNRWA in terms of education, health, collecting garbage, a sewage system, responsible for a sewage system, for water, for everything, they are welcome to do that. Otherwise, I believe that no other organization can deliver in the Gaza Strip.
Okay, UNRWA spokesperson Adnan Abu Hasna, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us today.
Thanks.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.